Meghan Markle listed as the beneficial owner of a shell company called Sussex Global Holdings Limited, which was incorporated on March 3, 2023, exactly 11 days before the first wire transfer occurred. The only financial activity this company engaged in was receiving $4.7 million on March 14, 2023. April 2024, the FBI opens a formal investigation and begins issuing subpoenas to financial institutions.
What if a single wire transfer, one transaction, routed through multiple jurisdictions, could quietly alter the power balance around one of the most scrutinized couples in the world? In recent days, online speculation has exploded around an alleged $4.7 million private loan said to involve Meghan Markle and a senior Saudi royal, widely identified in rumor circles as Khalid bin Salman. Let's be clear from the start. There is no confirmed public record proving such a transaction occurred, and no official statement from U.S. authorities confirming any investigation. But the structure described in these circulating reports raises serious legal and geopolitical questions worth examining. Because if, and this is a hypothetical, a high-profile American resident received millions from a foreign government-linked source structured through offshore entities, what would that actually trigger under U.S. law? That's where this story becomes far more complex than a headline. According to online claims, the alleged loan was structured through an offshore holding company incorporated in a jurisdiction such as the Cayman Islands, a common location for international investment vehicles. On paper, such companies are perfectly legal. Thousands exist, but their purpose often determines scrutiny. If funds move from a government-linked investment authority into a newly formed offshore entity and then into U.S.-based accounts, compliance systems inside major banks automatically flag unusual routing patterns, not because it's illegal, but because it's high risk. International wire transfers of that size normally pass through multiple correspondent banks, each generating its own internal compliance review. Suspicious activity reports, known as SRs, can be filed without the recipient ever being notified. These reports do not imply guilt. They simply alert regulators that a transaction deserves attention. And this is where the legal tension begins. If the transaction were truly a loan, it would require commercially reasonable terms, interest, repayment schedule, enforceability. If it were structured instead as an equity contribution, ownership stakes would need to be documented. If documentation described it differently in different jurisdictions, that discrepancy alone could invite questions. Under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, commonly referred to as FARA, individuals must disclose certain relationships with foreign principals if their activities could influence U.S. policy or public perception. The law is notoriously broad, and enforcement has increased in recent years. But again, this only applies if advocacy or representation is involved. There is no public evidence that any such registration violation has occurred. Still, the speculation persists. Why? Because when large sums intersect with geopolitics, audiences assume motive. Saudi Arabia, led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has invested heavily in reshaping its global image through entertainment, sports, media, and high-profile Western partnerships. The Kingdom's Vision 2030 program seeks modernization, diversification, and reputational recalibration. So when rumors suggest money flowing toward globally recognizable figures, narrative tension writes itself. Add in Prince Harry, still connected by blood to the British monarchy. And suddenly, the implications feel larger than a financial arrangement. Again, there is no confirmed criminal probe, no charges, no verified Treasury documents made public. But here is what is real. If a U.S. resident accepted millions from a foreign government-linked entity and failed to properly disclose it where required, whether on financial filings, immigration documents, or compliance forms, The consequences could range from civil penalties to criminal exposure. If a loan were deemed not commercially legitimate, tax authorities could recharacterize it as income. If funds were routed in ways that appeared designed to avoid reporting thresholds, regulators could examine structuring statutes. If advocacy aligned closely with the interests of the funding source, FARA questions might arise. These are conditional legal frameworks, not accusations, and that distinction matters. The reason this rumor gained traction is not just the amount, $4.7 million, but the timing described in online discussions. Observers have speculated about cash flow pressures following high-profile media contracts that did not renew as expected. Mortgage obligations, security expenses, production costs. Financial pressure narratives are powerful because they humanize vulnerability, but speculation about desperation does not equal evidence of misconduct. Here's what makes the story psychologically gripping: the idea that influence doesn't require espionage, only dependency. In geopolitical strategy, leverage often begins with obligation, a loan, a favor, a business partnership. Not illegal, not dramatic, just quietly binding. And that's why even unverified claims like this capture attention. Because modern power isn't always about overt alliances. Sometimes it's about private financing. So where does this leave us? At this moment, there is no publicly confirmed federal case, no court filings, no official indictment. If authorities were reviewing financial activity, they would not comment during preliminary stages. And many preliminary reviews never result in charges. But the broader lesson is important. In today's regulatory environment, any large cross-border transaction involving politically exposed persons triggers layered compliance mechanisms. Offshore vehicles are legal, but transparency determines risk. Loans are common, but documentation defines legitimacy. Advocacy is protected, but undisclosed foreign alignment can cross statutory lines. The story circulating online may prove unfounded, or it may simply reflect how little the public understands about international finance and foreign influence law. Either way, the tension lies not in what is proven, but in what would happen if it were true. And that's where this discussion becomes less about personalities and more about power. If a transaction like this were real, the first question investigators would not ask is, who did it? They would ask, why was it structured this way? Because structure tells intention. In legitimate international finance, simplicity is efficiency. When money travels through unnecessary layers, especially through offshore jurisdictions known for confidentiality, compliance departments start asking quiet questions. Not publicly, not dramatically, but methodically. If a $4.7 million sum originated from a sovereign-linked investment entity and passed through multiple banks before reaching a U.S. account, each intermediary institution would generate internal review logs. These reviews are not accusations. They are algorithmic responses to risk scoring. The public often misunderstands how this works. Banks are not looking for crime. They are looking for anomalies. For example, was the receiving company recently formed? Does it have employees? Does it have operating revenue? Is its stated purpose vague? Global consulting? Strategic advisory? Investment management? Does the beneficial owner qualify as a politically exposed person? PEP? If the answer to several of those is yes, the risk profile increases automatically. And here is where the rumored structure becomes interesting. Online discussions describe an offshore holding entity created shortly before the alleged transfer. If true, regulators would examine whether that entity had legitimate commercial operations or whether it functioned solely as a pass-through vehicle. There is nothing illegal about creating a holding company, but timing matters. If incorporation precedes a large inbound transfer by days or weeks, examiners look for economic substance. Did the company perform services, issue invoices, maintain staff, lease space, or did it simply receive funds and redistribute them? That distinction defines regulatory response. Now, consider the classification of funds. If a wire transfer is labeled capital contribution, that implies equity. If internal documentation elsewhere describes the same transaction as a personal loan, that creates inconsistency. In financial compliance, inconsistent classification raises audit flags. Why? Because equity creates ownership. Debt creates obligation. They are not interchangeable. If a foreign government-linked entity becomes equity holder in a company controlled by a politically visible American resident, disclosure expectations change dramatically. If it is instead a personal loan, repayment terms must exist. Interest must accrue. Maturity must be defined. And ideally, repayment behavior must follow. The absence of payment does not prove wrongdoing. Many loans defer principal, but long periods of inactivity combined with low interest and no collateral raise valuation questions. This is where tax authorities would enter. Hypothetically, under U.S. tax law, bona fide loans are not income. But if repayment is unlikely or terms are not commercially reasonable, regulators can recharacterize the funds as taxable income. That does not automatically mean fraud. It becomes a question of intent and documentation. And here is where the psychological tension deepens, because financial desperation narratives, whether accurate or exaggerated, create motive speculation. When high-profile contracts underperform or terminate early, when mortgage obligations remain constant, when security expenses exceed projections, the public begins constructing explanations. But speculation is not proof. Still, if federal agencies ever did examine such a transaction, they would not start with dramatic raids. They would start quietly. Subpoenas to banks, requests for wire records, beneficial ownership disclosures, communications between intermediaries, and often the subject would not know for months. Most financial investigations never become indictments. Many close quietly after documentation satisfies compliance thresholds. But the existence of layered offshore routing, if proven, would be enough to justify review. Now let's address the geopolitical dimension. When a foreign sovereign wealth structure interacts financially with a globally recognized public figure, national security analysts assess influence exposure, not espionage. Influence. Influence does not require secret documents. It requires access, proximity, credibility. If a recipient later appears at cultural events sponsored by the same funding ecosystem, observers connect dots, even when no legal violation exists. Saudi Arabia's modernization campaign, often branded under Vision 2030, has aggressively invested in sports leagues, film festivals, entertainment platforms, and Western partnerships. These initiatives are public and strategic. So if a high-profile figure participated in Saudi-sponsored initiatives after receiving funds, even unrelated funds, critics would inevitably question alignment. Again, participation in international events is not illegal, but perception drives narrative, and narrative drives scrutiny. The most dangerous part of rumors like this is not prosecution risk. It is reputational leverage. Because once a figure is perceived as financially connected to a foreign power, every public statement becomes filtered through that lens. Even neutral commentary becomes interpreted as strategic. And that is how influence suspicion grows, whether justified or not. But remember, as of now, there is no publicly verified federal case confirming any of this occurred, and that boundary matters. Yet the structural questions remain fascinating. Because if such a loan did exist, if investigators ever concluded that a foreign-linked financial arrangement crossed into disclosure territory, the consequences would depend entirely on classification, not morality, not media outrage. Classification. There are three major legal frameworks that would hypothetically matter. First, disclosure statutes. Under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, registration is required when someone acts at the order, request, or under the direction of a foreign principal in political or public influence activity. Receiving money. A loan does not trigger FARA advocacy tied to that relationship does. The critical legal test would be, was there direction? Was there coordination? Was there expectation of influence? If the answer were no, the statute would likely not apply. Second, financial structuring statutes. If funds were deliberately divided to avoid reporting thresholds, a practice known as structuring that can constitute a violation under the Bank Secrecy Act. But intent must be proven. Multi-stage transfers alone are not illegal. International wires commonly route through correspondent banks automatically. Intent is everything. Third, immigration disclosure. If a visa applicant failed to disclose required foreign financial relationships, that could become an administrative issue. But again, the threshold is material omission, not rumor, not speculation, documented misrepresentation. Now imagine the reputational risk if headlines suggested deportation, even without charges. Public perception alone could destabilize contracts, partnerships, endorsements, and that is why even unverified claims of an FBI inquiry create enormous tension. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not publicly confirm preliminary financial reviews. Silence is standard. That silence allows speculation to grow unchecked. But let's focus on the money itself. If the alleged $4.7 million were fully documented as a legitimate private loan, with repayment schedule, interest accrual, and declared on appropriate filings, the legal exposure would likely collapse. If it were equity, properly disclosed, compliance exposure would narrow. If it were neither, and documentation conflicted, that is when complexity begins, because contradictory classification is what transforms paperwork into narrative, and narrative into leverage. Here's what makes this situation uniquely dramatic. The individuals rumored to be involved sit at the intersection of celebrity, geopolitics, monarchy, and American residency. That intersection magnifies every financial movement. For ordinary citizens, private loans rarely trigger global debate. For globally recognized figures, even hypothetical loans trigger geopolitical analysis. That is the weight of visibility. So, what happens next? If such rumors are unfounded, they will eventually dissipate as no official documentation surfaces. If quiet compliance reviews occurred and found no violations, no announcement would be made. If, and only if, formal charges ever materialized, they would appear in federal court records first, not on social media. Until then, everything remains in the realm of conditional analysis. But one thing is certain. Large cross-border transfers tied to politically visible individuals are never just financial transactions. They are strategic events, even when legal, even when compliant, because power today is rarely exercised through public treaties. It moves through private capital. And sometimes, the most dramatic consequences begin with something that looks on paper, like an ordinary loan. At this stage, the most important question is no longer whether a loan existed. It's this: what would a foreign sovereign wealth structure actually gain from extending a multi-million-dollar private loan to a globally recognized public figure? Because modern geopolitical strategy rarely moves in obvious directions. Sovereign investment funds, particularly those aligned with national transformation programs, do not operate like private banks. They operate with strategic intent, not necessarily illegal intent. Strategic intent. Under Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 framework, billions have flowed into sports leagues, entertainment conglomerates, film festivals, media production deals, and global branding initiatives. The objective is not merely profit, it is reputational recalibration. Soft power. Soft power works quietly. You don't buy influence directly. You build networks, you cultivate goodwill. You create optionality. If, hypothetically, a high-profile Western public figure received financial support from a sovereign-linked entity, even as a legitimate loan, the relationship itself would become strategically valuable. Not because of secret instructions, not because of espionage, but because of alignment potential. If that individual later participates in cultural events, business partnerships, or public commentary that intersects with the funding country's interests, observers inevitably begin connecting dots, even if no coordination exists. And perception in geopolitics can be as powerful as proof. This is why intelligence agencies monitor influence exposure more closely than overt criminality. A financial relationship does not need to be illegal to create leverage. It simply needs to create dependency or obligation. Now consider the scale. $4.7 million is not transformative wealth at the sovereign level. For a nation-state investment authority, it is operationally minor. But at the individual level, it can be stabilizing capital. Mortgage coverage, production funding, liquidity breathing room, and liquidity creates silence. Again, none of this implies wrongdoing, but in geopolitical calculus, small investments often produce disproportionate influence. Let's examine the optics. If a public figure facing financial pressure suddenly secures private foreign financing, critics frame it as rescue. Supporters frame it as opportunity. Opponents frame it as vulnerability. That framing war matters more than the transaction itself, because influence today is narrative-driven. Now imagine regulators quietly reviewing documentation behind such a transfer. They would not be looking for drama. They would be asking technical questions. Was the loan arm's length? Were interest rates commercially reasonable? Were repayment obligations enforceable? Was disclosure made where legally required? Did subsequent public behavior align suspiciously with funding interests? If all answers satisfy compliance standards, the review ends. If inconsistencies emerge, escalation begins. Escalation does not mean indictment. It means interviews. It means document expansion. It means international cooperation requests. Financial investigations involving cross-border sovereign entities move slowly. They require treaty channels, diplomatic coordination, and evidentiary thresholds, which brings us to another dimension rarely discussed: diplomatic pressure. If, hypothetically, an American investigation ever touched funds originating from a strategic ally, diplomatic considerations would inevitably enter the conversation, not to block justice, but to manage consequences. Financial enforcement and foreign policy often intersect in uncomfortable ways. That is not conspiracy. That is statecraft. So when online speculation claims that such a loan could spark federal investigation, the dramatic element is not simply criminal exposure. It is geopolitical sensitivity. Because once sovereign capital meets celebrity influence, every agency evaluates risk through its own lens. Treasury sees compliance. Justice sees statutory exposure. Intelligence sees influence mapping. State Department sees bilateral relations, and the individual at the center sees reputation. That convergence is what makes this rumored loan so narratively explosive. Not the money, the intersection. And when intersections like that appear, even in rumor form, they rarely fade quickly. They either dissolve quietly, or they reshape power dynamics behind closed doors. Now we arrive at the most important layer of this entire discussion. Leverage. In global politics, leverage rarely begins with confrontation. It begins with quiet financial entanglement. If, hypothetically, a prominent American resident with ongoing proximity to a foreign monarchy accepted multi-million-dollar financing from a sovereign-linked entity, even as a private loan, the relationship itself becomes a variable in future negotiations, not necessarily because of wrongdoing, but because obligation alters posture. If repayment deadlines approach, timing matters. If public criticism emerges, discretion matters. If future partnerships are proposed, influence matters. And here is where the stakes become personal. The individuals rumored to be involved sit at a rare crossroads: monarchy, media, American residency, global celebrity. That convergence amplifies even minor financial arrangements into geopolitical headlines. Now consider immigration implications. If a visa holder is required to disclose certain foreign financial relationships, and documentation later reveals omissions, intentional or accidental, administrative consequences can follow. Not automatically deportation, not dramatic midnight removals, but review. Immigration law is technical, not theatrical. And technical violations often produce civil outcomes long before criminal ones. Tax authorities would examine classification. Financial regulators would examine routing. Foreign agent statutes would examine coordination. Each operates independently. Each requires proof. And as of now, there is no publicly confirmed proof that any of the rumored events occurred. That distinction must remain clear. But here's the reality that fuels the suspense. Large cross-border sovereign transfers involving politically visible individuals almost always generate internal review, even if they ultimately clear. Silence does not equal guilt, but silence allows speculation to expand. And in today's digital ecosystem, speculation travels faster than subpoenas. So what are the possible endings? 1. The rumor collapses. No documentation surfaces. No inquiry exists. Narrative fades. 2. A quiet compliance review occurred, found no statutory violation, and closed without public announcement. 3. Documentation eventually emerges, clarifying the structure, the terms, and the disclosures, neutralizing suspicion. Or 4. Deeper questions surface, shifting the conversation from rumor to record. At this moment, we stand in uncertainty, and uncertainty is fertile ground for narrative escalation. But here is the critical takeaway. Modern influence is not always about espionage or conspiracy. It is about capital, about dependency, about who owes whom, and sometimes what appears to be just a loan can become something much larger in the court of public perception, even if it remains legally sound. That is why this story resonates, not because of proven wrongdoing, but because it exposes how fragile reputational power becomes when foreign capital enters the equation, and whether this rumored $4.7 million loan proves real, exaggerated, or entirely unfounded. It forces a deeper question. In a world where sovereign wealth intersects with celebrity influence, how do we define independence? And more importantly, how much transparency is enough? If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe for deeper breakdowns of the power structures operating behind global headlines. Turn on notifications, because when narrative, finance, and geopolitics collide, developments rarely unfold in predictable ways. The next chapter, if there is one, won't begin with a press conference. It will begin with paperwork. And paperwork, in the modern world, is where power quietly shifts.